Hi, I'm Atul and welcome to EcoExpert TV. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Paul Eakins here, who's the Professor of Energy and Environment Policy at the Energy Institute within University College London. So Paul, what I'd like to ask you about is this gap that some people perceive between the climate science and the definitiveness of climate science that a lot of people would interpret that as, and then environmental policies and climate change policies, and why is there this gap, and why aren't policymakers just simply following what the science says?
Well, to some extent, some policymakers are trying to follow what the science says, but I think it's important to appreciate that climate science has three characteristics which combined are about as difficult as it is possible to be for policymakers and policy making in the kind of societies that we have. The first is that it's uncertain, and all predictions about future climates have to be hedged about with lots of ifs and buts, and that makes policy making difficult. Second, it's potentially pretty bad news, and we have an enormous propensity as human beings not to believe bad news when we don't want to, and there are many other examples of that. And thirdly, it's not only very long term, and therefore climate scientists frequently talk about timescales after 2050, by 2200 or whatever, which of course in climate terms is a very short period of time, but in political terms is a very long period of time. But it's also impossible to point to any particular events that may occur, like the floods in Pakistan or the floods in Queensland last year, the great fires in Russia, or even these great storms that we've had over the last few weeks in the United States, and say categorically that they are the result of climate change.
That's the problem, isn't it?
All the climate models suggest that those kinds of problems are going to become more frequent in the future and indeed more destructive. But you can't point the finger at any particular event and say, we can be sure that that wouldn't have happened without climate change.
Yeah, and it also strikes me that there's something about the word inconvenience, and I think the film An Inconvenient Truth was very appropriate for what's happening, because it seems to me that the climate science is very inconvenient, that people will have to make changes which are inconvenient, and it's inconvenient for the politicians to have to think about long-term policies and yet have to be elected in a short-term way.
Yes, I mean, I think it's possible to overdo the inconvenience in the sense that because climate change is a fairly long-term issue and a long-term prospect, the kinds of changes that we would need to make in our lifestyles could be spread out over a number of years. But certainly there are certain ways of life to which people in the West have become very used, like driving everywhere, like increasingly flying on relatively short trips to all parts of the world, which undoubtedly are inconsistent with current technologies, with any kind of action on climate change. And accepting that and then starting to change those lifestyles is something that politicians find very difficult, and the reason is that they're afraid that voters will throw them out if they try to force people to do it.
And in your opinion, what do you think is going to happen in the next sort of 10 to 15 years in terms of adoption of renewable technologies and environmental policy generally?
Well, I think the only hope for a kind of climate response that is anywhere near proportionate to what it needs to be if we're going to keep climate change to within any kind of reasonable bounds is that there should become a clean technology race in order to produce the next industrial revolution. It's quite clear to me from everything I know about Asian growth, apart from anything else, what's happening in India and China, but also the way in which people in the West are very attached to certain aspects of their lifestyles, that we're not going to get a wholesale rejection of the consumer society. And under those circumstances, we've simply got to decarbonise those most carbon-intensive aspects of society as fast as we can, and that will only happen if the full weight of capitalism goes behind developing clean technologies. So we have to create markets for those clean technologies, and those markets have to pull the technologies through at breakneck speed. And if that were to start to happen in Korea, in China, in India, as well as in certain countries in the Western world, then I think we could get change that is much faster than we might otherwise get. But if it doesn't happen, then I'm afraid we'll continue to see the relatively incremental, though positive change that we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years.
So it's a case of using the forces of capitalism and market forces to positive effect, create this green technology race. I really like that idea, I like that phrase, and you use that energy of capitalism in the right direction.
Yeah, it's important to understand what it would take to send capitalism off in that direction, because it's quite clear that it won't go off in that direction by itself, otherwise we'd already be there. It will take a fundamental shift in relative prices, which is why anyone who knows anything about these issues talks about carbon pricing as being absolutely fundamental in order to get these technologies moving. But it will also take a whole range of other kinds of policies, both regulations, voluntary agreements, information policies, to back up those changes in relative prices and to give people the support they need to make those kinds of shifts.
And finally, something that I find very interesting is that sometimes when I talk to individuals, they feel a bit frustrated about the limited things that they feel they can do. And from what you're saying, it actually sounds like it really needs to start at the government level to encourage the businesses to go in a certain direction, which in turn will enable people to make the positive changes that they want to. What's your thoughts on the interaction between government, businesses and individuals?
Well, there are obviously great interactions between all of them. We definitely need government to act in order to change the kind of frameworks, the pricing framework, so that it becomes cheaper to do the right thing and more expensive to do the wrong thing, but also regulations and infrastructure and those kinds of things. From an individual point of view, the evidence is now very clear about what the major causes of the problems are, and all individuals can make a contribution to that. The first thing is use of energy in the home. We all use lots of energy. Most of it is wasted because our homes aren't properly insulated. We can do something about that. The second thing is the food we eat. Most of the food we eat is produced in very energy intensive ways, and there are lots of ways of cutting down on the quantity of energy that we need to use for the food that we produce. And the third thing is the way we transport ourselves about. People drive and fly much more than they need to. Now, clearly part of that problem can be resolved by government in making public transport easier. And I'm looking forward to the day when a city like London, which is where we're doing this interview, it simply becomes unacceptable to drive any kind of private vehicle within the city limits. Public transport is perfectly acceptable, and of course if there weren't so many cars, public transport would be much more efficient. So we're moving slowly in that direction, but we need to accelerate quite dramatically, and of course individuals can help that process.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Paul Ekins, thank you very much for your thoughts and reflections there on the current state of play with economics and politics and the environment. So, Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Smell you in the summer air, but it tells me you're no longer there. We used to play in fields of sugar cane when we were both young and therefore same.